Welcome to the Zoe Routh Leadership Podcast, where we explore the future and what this means for your leadership. We ask the big questions. What's happening on the horizon? What does this mean for us? And most importantly, what skills do I need now for leadership of the future? It's time to explore. Let's go.
Hi, it's Zoe, and today I'm in Melbourne. I'm not in my usual podcasting bunker. I've got all my tech with me, but it didn't all work out. So if the sound is a little bit different than normal, that's why. And I do apologize if it's distracting for you. But the conversation is amazing. So my guest today is Dr. Danny Brassell. He is a teacher originally. He has written 16 books. He's a very inspiring and engaging speaker, and he founded thereadinghabit.com. We are talking about reading. Yes, reading. I love reading. I'm an avid reader, and so is Danny. So I totally geeked out in our conversation. But hopefully it's something useful for you too, because no doubt as a leader, you know that leaders are readers, and the best leaders invest a lot of their time and energy in reading, whether that's audiobooks, podcasts, or some other way of consuming information and education and stories. So in this far-reaching conversation with Danny, we dive into tips and tricks and rationales and insights from reading and how you can get the most out of your reading experience. If you don't have a reading experience, you'll want one after this. So let's get into it. Well, all the way from Denver, Colorado. Welcome to the show, Dr. Danny Brassell.
Thanks so much for having me, Zoe. More importantly, thanks so much for spreading some joy in the world. We need a lot more of you.
Depends on the day. Sometimes it's less joy and more not joy. So we'll go with joy today. I think that's a good flavor to start with. And thank you for everything that you're doing in your work with leaders and encouraging people to be readers, which I'm so excited to talk to you about because I'm an avid reader and a huge proponent that people should be reading. So it's nice to find a like-minded fellow book nut.
Two peas in a pod. Sounds great.
That's right. So how did you fall into this whole idea of advocating for reading?
Yeah, so it's ironic, Zoe, that I'm considered America's leading reading ambassador because I hated reading growing up. My father was a librarian, and I always hated the public library. It always smelled funny to me. The furniture was uncomfortable. There was always some elderly woman telling me to be quiet. There's always a freaky homeless guy. I thought he was a vampire hanging out by the bookshelves. I always hated the library. And it wasn't until I started teaching in the inner city in South Central Los Angeles where I saw a lot of my students didn't have the advantages I had growing up. And I basically said, shame on me. I mean, I was very blessed, Zoe. Both of my parents were in the home. We weren't very wealthy, but we always had food on the table. And my parents always read in front of us kids, to us kids, and we had plenty of access to reading materials. And so it really became my mission to bring the joy back into education by really getting kids to love reading.
I was thinking back about your days when you were a little kid and you were having books read to you and discovering books. What was it about books that got you excited? Do you remember?
Well, when I was a kid, I wasn't really excited about it because my parents always tried to read to me. I was one of those kids that if I had to do a book report, I'd watch the movie version and do the book report based off the movie.
All right. So what changed?
Well, really watching that, I saw a bunch of kids that they didn't have the access that I had growing up. And I mean, you know, it's not as bad in Australia, but in America, I mean, I think they do an adequate job of teaching kids how to read. But the question I always ask people is, what good is it teaching a kid how to read if they never want to read? I teach kids why to read because I've never had to tell a kid, go watch TV. I've never had to tell a kid, go play a video game. And I never want to have to tell a kid, go read. I want them to choose to do it because they love it. And so there's simple strategies I share with parents to get their kids more excited about reading, because the more excited you are to read, the more likely you are to read, and the more you read, the better you get.
So I think the strategies, I'm not sure if they're the same or different for getting kids to read as they are to get leaders to read. So let's start with kids. How can we get kids more excited about diving into a book?
Well, it's really based on interest, Zoe, more than anything. I was with, when I taught second graders, 8-year-olds, I had a little boy, Kiara, whose first grade teacher told me, Kiara don't know nothing. I'm like, well, thank you for that. Well, Kiara, who didn't know nothing, comes into my classroom one day and he's like, "Hey, Mr. Brassell, you see Barkley last night? He had 18 points and 16 boards." I'm like, "Thank you, Kiara." Because from that day forward, Zoe, after lunch every day, I'd sit Kiara on my lap. We'd read the LA Times sports page together. And wouldn't you know, he was one of my best readers by the end of the year. Now, he didn't read anything but sports, but I always tell parents, the little boy who only reads Captain Underpants is going to be a better reader than the little boy who refuses to read anything. Captain Underpants is the gateway drug to Shakespeare, but you got to get the kids excited about it. And so it's always based on interest, and that's why you'll see a lot of adults, they start to become readers because you're forced to read certain things in school. I mean, when I was in high school, I remember one of my teachers made us read The Scarlet Letter by Nathaniel Hawthorne. And no offense to all the Nathaniel Hawthorne fans out there, but the story is about Hester Prynne, and she commits adultery, and so she has to wear an A on her chest. And I raised my hand in class, and I asked my teacher if I could wear a B on my chest because I was so bored reading that book. And so we'll segue into the next question we're going to get into, which is leaders. The reason a lot of leaders become readers is because they start being very, very specific about the types of things that they read. Most leaders are going to want to read about other leaders. If you're into engineering, you're going to read engineering books. And this is what I tell people. I mean, if you love People Magazine, read People Magazine. If you love reading the TV Guide, read the TV Guide. So that's really how you get, I've looked at lots of successful leaders. And while there's plenty of readers that don't necessarily become successful leaders, I have never once read about a successful leader who was not also an avid reader. And that includes people in military, the government, business, athletics, entertainment, everybody.
So that depends on how you define successful. I think, getting to the top rank is one definition of success. Actually being effective and creating results with others is another way.
Absolutely. I would agree with that definition for sure.
So before we get into how do we get leaders to be readers, I want to actually deal with this whole idea of consuming media, because reading is one way to consume information or media. How does reading fit along the suite of other potential activities for becoming educated? Podcasts, videos, social media, all that kind of thing. So do you see reading as a primary venue, and why? Or is it just one of the selections we can have as part of becoming more educated?
I love that question, Zoe. Nobody's ever asked me that. I think It's part of a suite of different things. Most people fear technology, and I tell people, there's a great quote by General Eric Shinseki. He used to be the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the United States, and he said, if you don't like change, you're going to like irrelevance even less. And he's absolutely right about that. You can't stick your head in dirt and hope the technology goes away. It's here, and it's been the same argument for thousands of years. I mean, the Greeks used to complain that their kids were stupid because they had to write things down. They didn't memorize everything. Oh, this is going to be the end of civilization. TV used to be the biggest problem. Now you hear about social media, or I was just speaking at a school and everybody was freaking out about ChatGPT and artificial intelligence. You got to figure out ways to embrace that technology and use it towards your advantage. And I think when done properly, you can do all kinds of things. I mean, podcasts, like your podcast is always fantastic. So if you look at the Fortune 500 companies around the world, over half of their CEOs are dyslexic. Well, dyslexics, and I've worked with lots of dyslexics, they tend to process information a lot better with their ears than visually. And one of the best tips I always give dyslexics is to listen to Audible books and listen to podcasts. It's a great way. Richard Branson's dyslexic, one of the wealthiest people on the planet, and he's never let that get in the way of his leadership abilities. One of the strategies I always share with parents is turn on the television set and put on the closed captioning on the television set. I don't know if there's a law in Australia, but in the United States, there's been a law for 30 years that says every television set sold in the United States has to have closed captioning. And parents, when I suggest that, they say, well, wait a second. If the show is in English and the subtitles are in English, what good does that do? And I'm like, well, that's a fair point, but let me make a point. Have you ever watched a show with subtitles and not looked at the subtitles? It's very difficult to do. Your brain is actually directed towards that text. There's actually research to support this. If you look at reading scores around the world, the more kids watch TV, the lower their reading scores are in every single country on the planet except for one. The kids that watch the most TV on the planet also have the highest reading scores. It's Finland. And people always ask me, well, how can that be? I'm like, well, Finland makes really bad TV shows. And so what they do is they import all these old American sitcoms like Happy Days and I Love Lucy, and they subtitle them in Finnish. The kids are reading constantly. And so that gets right to the core of your question, Zoe, is we need to figure out ways to embrace these different types of things. I love it when people say that kids don't know how to read nowadays. I'm like, are you kidding me? With social media, advertisements, things like this, the average person today sees more text in a day than a person living in the 19th century saw their entire lifetime. Now, I'm not saying it's Jane Austen or Charles Dickens, but it is. This kind of goes into when you're talking about a definition of success, it's also a definition of literacy. Well, what does literacy look like? And I think literacy can look like different things, just like success can look like different things.
Yeah. Thank you for that fulsome answer. So it clears up a little bit of, it's not just books, it's any platform that allows us to learn, discover, and experience fictional worlds if you are reading fiction. Do you have any recommendations of how to qualify or filter your topics for attention, let alone the platforms?
Well, I don't know about filtering, but I know that there's ways to get kids to actually pay attention a little bit. The first one, the most significant thing all of us should do, which the research is very strong in this, is we should read aloud to our kids. I mean, Emily Buchwald said that kids are made readers on the laps of their parents. And so whenever I see parents that say, oh, my kids don't read, and I'm like, well, do you read? And they're like, well, I don't have time to read. I'm like, yeah, who has time to read after you watch TV, go to the mall, go out shopping? I mean, kids aren't stupid. They don't see us reading. They're never going to be reading. You know, I used to always confront dads. I'd say, hey, Dad, you want to know why your kids like football so much? It's because that's the only time you spend with them. If you spent your time reading with them, your kids would be readers. All kids are paying attention to us constantly. And so there's just different things that I like to share with parents. I mean, I have 3 of my own children, Zoe, and, you know, things work differently. Every kid's a little bit different. One of the habits I tried to get my kids into very early is I think television's here to stay. And so, again, I'm not going to fear television. I'm going to embrace it and use it as a resource. And so I made the rule very early on that the kids could turn on the TV, but they had to bring me something to read first. And so when the kids were little, they'd bring me picture books and we'd read those. Now they're all teenagers, and so they'll usually bring me their iPad and some silly story on their iPad. We'll read that before they're allowed to turn on the TV. But that became a habit. I don't think social media necessarily is a bad thing. I think if you're going to look at all the negatives, it could be a bad thing. But there's plenty of positive ways to use social media. I mean, I think since every kid has one of these things in their pockets, let's figure out a way to embrace it. And so one of the things I teach kids to do is I use my calendar constantly, and I'm always trying to learn different things. And so I have all these reminders set in my iPhone. So like I'm trying to learn Archimedes, the quote, "Give me a place to stand on and I will move the earth." I'm just trying to memorize that quote. I just recently read the book Dune. And so every day at 9/11, I have this update from Dune. There's a thing called the Litany Against Fear. I'm trying to memorize it. So it goes something like, I must not fear. Fear is the mind killer. Fear is a little death. And it goes on. I love Henry V by Shakespeare. And I always wanted to quote Shakespeare. And so my favorite part of Henry V is the St. Crispian's Day speech, which is about 50 lines long. It happens in Act 4, Scene 4. So every day at 4:04, I have a reminder where I'm trying to memorize, what's he that wishes so? My cousin Westmoreland? No, my fair cousin, so I'm learning that. I got married on December 20th. So every day at 12:20, I have a reminder to tell my wife I love her. So you can also use your phone as a way to introduce a little bit more kindness in the world. So that's a very long answer to your short question, but you and I are on the same wavelength, Zoe. I get annoyed when I hear people defining these things in very narrow terms. I'm like, well, that just depends, who you are. I mean, there's lots of different ways to define these things. I say Let's figure out what a person's interest. I mean, I can't remember any of my bosses my entire lifetime saying, "Hey, Danny, I need you to read this novel by tomorrow." But that's what we do in school. And yet I don't see any kind of emphasis on technical reading, which is more like what most business people are going to have to do is, read this stock report or read these assessments and critically think. There's lots of different types of reading is basically the gist of it.
There are. And appreciate the fact that you love Dune, because I love Dune. I read it when I was a teenager, and I read it recently again about 3 years ago. And I raced through the entire volumes of books that are in the Dune universe that his son and Kevin Anderson went on to write. So I'm like a big Dune geek.
Frank Herbert's amazing. I just want to know. I want to read everything. I wish he could have written more. I just love the Dune series. It's fantastic.
Yeah, the prequels that his son and Kevin Anderson wrote are pretty amazing too. Like, you can tell that the sixth book in the series is quite different. It's got a very different voice, and I kind of missed that as I read it. I'm like, oh, this isn't quite Frank Herbert, but you kind of just, well, what can you do? He's dead. And it's like, wow.
That's great, though. You noticed that. You're a reader. That's great.
Yeah. And what I wanted to also highlight, is a really big difference between Frank Herbert and Henry V. Like, that is worlds apart. So it comes to my next question, Danny, is do you have a plan for your reading, or do you just go where your interest goes?
Well, that's a great question. Man, I just need you all the time. These are questions people don't normally ask me. My answer on that is yes. It depends. I like things that make me laugh. When I read Douglas Adams' The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, it was the first book I had to put down because I was laughing so hard. It's just so well written, and he died way too young. Gosh, I'm like, how many books were we denied because he passed away at a young age? I do a lot of humor when I'm training executives how to create their presentations. They often ask me, can you add some humor to this? And so by reading lots of funny things, I can give lots of tips on that. I work with a lot of leaders, and I love reading about leaders. So I'm reading tons of biographies. I guess really the shortest answer to your question, Zoe, is some people collect baseball cards. Some people collect stamps. I collect stories. I'm constantly reading books looking for any kind of anecdote that'll just push me over the top. I mean, actually, the book I'm writing right now, I have a great story. You probably know him very well because you're in Australia, but no American I've talked to has ever heard of this guy, Cliff Young. Do you know Cliff Young?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's one of the most inspirational stories I've ever read in my life, and I love introducing that story to American audiences. And for the people that haven't heard about Cliff Young, there was this ultra marathon it's about 535 miles, I don't know how many kilometers, from Melbourne to Sydney. And it was like in the early 1980s, around 1983, and all these ultramarathoners get set to race, and here comes like this 60-year-old farmer guy, Cliff Young, in galoshes and his overalls, and everybody's looking at him like, you're going to try and run this race? Well, they start off, and everybody's running, and of course, Cliff Young was in the back and way behind everybody. But a funny thing happened. When everybody else went to sleep at night, nobody had told Cliff that he could stop running, and so he'd run through the night. And not only did he win the race, he won by like 10 hours, set a record. And my favorite part of the story is he felt bad about beating all these other competitors, that when he got the prize money, he shared it with all of his competitors. And I think he was awarded like some national honor or whatever. But I'm like, wow, there's ordinary people every day who do extraordinary things. And so those are the stories I'm constantly, because I was watching this horrible show on TV the other night, Zoe, called The News, and it totally depressed me. I like things that uplift me, and that's why I stopped watching the news, and I'm just reading about people that inspire me. I'll listen to your podcast, all these podcasts that are feeding my head with positive things. A friend of mine who passed away, Keith Harley, was a great speaker on attitude, and he always says, a lot of people say garbage in, garbage out. He's like, that's wrong. Garbage in, garbage stays. So one of my mentors, Charlie Tremendous Jones, used to say, you're the same today as you will be in 5 years, except for two things: the people you meet and the books you read. So be very wise and surround yourself with people that lift you up. And make sure you're filling your mind with positive things.
Hey, it's Zoe. If you're enjoying these leadership insights, join us in the Amplifiers Academy. It's bite-sized leadership development through self-paced videos and exercises, templates, checklists, resources, and an online community to connect with other leaders. It's Amplifiers Academy, your gateway to better, stronger leadership. See you there. So what I got from that is you do have a plan in terms of your reading serves a purpose, and the purpose of your reading is to collect stories that inspire and uplift for the purpose of your educational practice. And I think that's probably a seed to think about reading from a leadership or a leader's point of view. So if I think about my reading plan, I only really just sort of thought about a reading plan this year because I read so widely, and I'm like, there's so much to read. How do I actually make a selection? And so I've narrowed it down to a couple of things. So now I sort of have a couple of different angles for my reading. One is the fun stuff. And at the moment, I'm interested in spy thrillers and World War II spy thrillers. That's kind of fun. And
have you read Eye of the Needle?
No, Eye of the Needle. I'll take that book recommendation.
Write that one down. Ken Follett.
Oh, Ken Follett.
That book is fantastic. Eye of the Needle. And it was made into a wonderful movie with Donald Sutherland and Kate Nelligan. You got to read Eye of the Needle. That book is, you'll finish that in a night. That's fantastic book.
Cool. So there's Eye of the Needle, Ken Follett. So yeah, that's sort of one avenue of the fun stuff. I'm reading science fiction, particularly climate fiction stuff, because that's in line with the genre of writing that I'm doing in my own fiction writing world. And then I have the business side of things where I'm reading the future of leadership type of books. And a fourth kind of angle is the craft of writing to help me be a better writer. So I kind of got like 4 streams at the moment. I kind of roll between them, and that's enough for my butterfly brain to keep me occupied, but it's still enough of a container that I don't go all over the place.
That's great.
And all of these selections are based on particular goals I have in mind, whether it's just for fun and pure entertainment or to build my own writing career or to build my leadership development business. So let's take it back to the leaders that are listening now. And they probably roll the eyes that, yes, they need to be reading more. And they don't. Why is that so?
Well, I think, people love to say they don't have time. But I think the best way to start and end your day is to fill it with something positive. And you should be reading about, obviously, if you want to be an effective leader, you should be reading about effective leaders, no matter what it is that you're doing. When President Eisenhower when he was an Army cadet, he read all kinds of things about military history. That was what he specifically read about. I love that you were talking about science fiction, because there's actually lots of studies that show people that read science fiction are smarter than most people. I don't know why that is.
That's so true. Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
The vocabulary, science fiction is great for expanding your vocabulary. There's all kinds of things that are done in science fiction with vocabulary. Yeah, I don't know why that would be, but, one of my favorite science fiction writers is Robert Heinlein, and I might be screwing this up. It was either him or Harlan Ellison who said the 2 most common elements in the universe are nitrogen and stupidity. I just always thought that was fantastic. You're very good about the way you're reading. I read, so I have my 3 kids and my wife, and so this is a strategy for all the parents out there. It's a great date to have with each of your kids. And so I have different books for my different kids. So my oldest daughter is 19. She's really into Game of Thrones. And so we're reading the George R.R. Martin books, which,
they're brutal. Yeah.
They're kind of graphic, but she's into it. And I believe in letting, if that's what she wants, that's what we'll do. My son, he's really into military history. And so the book we're reading is actually really cool. It's this autobiography by this British general from World War I and World War II. His name was Sir Adrian de Wiart Carton. He's like missing an eye, missing a hand. He was like injured, wounded 13 times in battle, but my son loves it. He's a fascinating guy. And then for some reason, my youngest daughter, she's into literature. We just read The Great Gatsby, which I hate that book, Zoe, but she liked it. And
really?
Yeah, I hate it. I hate the story. Actually, so I will say this. After reading it again with Samantha, I'm convinced S. Scott Fitzgerald, the guy knows how to write a sentence. I'm like, just a beautiful writer. Beautiful, beautiful writing. I hate the story, but the writing, I'll give him his credit on that. And I won't recommend this to anybody. We're reading right now Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens. And if you read Oliver Twist, it is so difficult to read aloud because half of the book is in Cockney. And then I realize how stupid we are as a society nowadays because I have to get out a dictionary on almost every sentence. I'm like, oh my gosh, peasants were reading this book 200 years ago. It is so well written in terms of vocabulary. I mean, it's unbelievable to me. And then my wife, she loves the Outlander series. So we actually just finished reading a whole bunch of the Outlander books by Diana Gabaldon. But now we're reading this cool series by this woman, Beth Brower, called The Unselected Journals of Emma M. Lyon. And it's actually just a delightful series. It's something I would have never thought I'd be interested in. It's like Elizabethan England, and it's this woman, and she has 3 men friends, and they just make this kind of cool, awkward foursome, and they're just delightful. They're just nice. And there's just, all of those genres are things that I would never normally read on my own. So I like that you're looking at those different things. I usually have about 10 books going at the same time, so that's my problem.
Yes, I know that problem too. It's like, which one will I settle into? And sometimes I don't settle into any of them, so they get read all at the same time. How many books do you end up getting through a year? Do you know? Do you track them?
Well, I have to read a lot so one of my websites, lazyreaders.com, anybody can subscribe. It's a free subscription. It's one of the top book clubs online. Every month I update it with 10 new book recommendations, 3 or 4 adult level, 3 or 4 young adult level, and 3 or 4 children's level books, all under 250 pages. So people that say they have no time to read, well, now you have something you can read during a boring meeting. Because of that book club, I have to read lots of different things. And so I actually go through about 5,000 books a year. And people are like, you're reading 5,000 books? I'm like, well, Paul Tagliabue, who was the commissioner of the National Football League in America, when he retired, somebody asked, what are you going to do now that you're retired? He said, well, I'm going to read a lot more than the first and last chapter of books. And I'm like, yeah, I kind of get that. If you have to read a lot, a book has to be amazing for me to read every single word. But this is a strategy for everybody out there. You know, a lot of us are taught to finish what we start. And I think that's stupid advice. I mean, think of a book like a piece of food. If you take a bite of something, you're like, oh, that's nasty. Well, maybe it gets better. Oh, no, it's nasty. If you don't like the first couple of chapters, you're probably not going to like the rest of the book. Just put it down. There was over 4 million books written in English alone last year. Some of them are pretty good. Don't waste your time on the bad ones. I mean, another thing that you had said, Zoe, which I like, though, is that you're writing, and so you were reading a genre specifically on the type of genre you're trying to write for. And that's what, there's not a single writer that's not an avid reader. You cannot be a good writer if you're not a good reader. I used to love Michael Crichton, was one of my favorite authors, wrote Jurassic Park and The Great Train Robbery is one of my favorite books. But when I read Jurassic Park, I knew that he was a fan of Jules Verne because both of those books start the same way. So if you ever read 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea by Jules Verne, the first page tells you all these historically accurate events. It's like, oh, in 1857, this ship sunk in the North Atlantic. Later that year, another ship sunk in the North Atlantic. You know, a couple of years later, there were survivors on this ship, and they said that they saw a bright light coming from the ocean that sunk them. And so basically, he's giving you a bunch of facts, and then he's inserting the Nautilus submarine. And now you're like, oh, did that actually happen? Because he gave you a bunch of facts beforehand. Jurassic Park's the same way. It starts off, it's like, oh, in 1955, Watson and Crick discovered the double helix for DNA. In the early 60s, companies started using it for plants, and then they started using it to clone animals. And then in 1975, Gynotech started using it to clone dinosaurs. And you're like, really? I didn't know we could clone dinosaurs. Well, it just gave you a bunch of facts. And so like, oh, it's a very good sales. That's what a good salesperson's doing, is they're getting you to say yes, yes, yes. And so you just get in that stream like, oh, these must all be facts. It's just really, that's what I love about reading good writers, though, is trying to figure out, well, who their influences are. And, you know, it's just hilarious that I'm like this avid reader now. I actually one of the things I train my students to do is I'm like, oh, if you want somebody to read your book, You got to put a cool cover and get like some good testimonials. And I always show people this book. I'm like, I once read this book because above the title, it said, "This is the scariest book I've ever read, Stephen King." And so I had to read that book. And so ironically, the book is called Fear by L. Ron Hubbard, the guy that's the founder of Scientology. He was a really good science fiction writer. This is like a 200-page book. And it took me 2 hours to read it, and I was freaking out. I mean, that's a crazy book, the way it's written. It's like, it's all about a guy who's missing his hat, and he's trying to figure out what happened to my hat, and he goes through what happened to his hat, and it's just a really, the ending of that one.
Okay, I've got that one down on my list now too. So after a lifetime and so much focus on reading, what I've picked up what it's given to you is great anecdotes, great stories that you can share, bits of joy. What else has reading done for you, which is making you want to share the joy of reading with others?
Well, that's great. Zoe, you have wonderful questions, Zoe. I commend you for that. It's really your passport to the world, let's go back to Jules Verne. There's a children's book I love. It's called It Can't Be Done, Nellie Bly. It's a true story of Nellie Bly, who Americans don't know any of their history. It drives me nuts. And Nellie Bly was basically the first muckraker journalist. She was an investigative journalist, and she worked for the New York World, whose editor was a guy by the name of Joseph Pulitzer. And the best-selling book of the day was Around the World in 80 Days by Jules Verne. And Nellie Bly went to her publisher and she said, "Mr. Pulitzer, I'd like to try to go around the world in 80 days. And he replied, "It can't be done, Nellie Bly." But he saw, this might sell some newspapers. And so he sent her to try to go around the world in 80 days. And she failed to go around the world in 80 days. She did it in 72 days. And the best part of the story is one of the first things she did is when she went through France, she wanted to visit Jules Verne. And a lot of people don't know this. Jules Verne never left France his entire life. And yet he wrote a book called Around the World in 80 Days. And he was delighted that not only was somebody attempting to go around the world in 80 days, but that it was a woman. It was just this really cool story. But that's what I love about books is, it gets you thinking about, when I read The Kite Runner, oh my gosh, by Khalid Hosseini, one of the most beautifully written books I've ever read in my life. And it made me think about, well, what's it like in Afghanistan? It got me thinking about that. You read Chinua Achebe, Things Fall Apart. You start thinking about politics in Nigeria. I mean, Long Walk to Freedom by Nelson Mandela about South Africa. I'm like, oh my gosh, I'll read poetry by Pablo Neruda from Chile, or one of my favorite South American authors is Isabel Allende. I can read anything she's written, but it gets you to go to these places where maybe you never go to that place, but a good author. Maybe this is why we like science fiction, is it can take you to another place, and a really good author gets you to paint. They paint the whole picture for you, and this is why I actually always tell parents, let your kid watch the movie version of the book. And parents are like, why would you do that? And I'm like, I'll tell you right now, I've worked with lots of kids, and when they see the movie and they read the book, they always say the same thing. Wow, the movie's awesome, but the book is a whole lot better. And we'll do a perfect example. Dune, there's now at least 2 or 3 versions of Dune, and they still aren't even close to as good as the books. The books are so much better.
Oh, they're rich.
I mean, just visualization, and it's tough too because it's a lot of inner dialogue. You can't really capture it on film, so that's a crazy answer, I guess, for you. But that's what books do for me, is they get me to understand. You get to understand different cultures too. There's so many different things, or understanding what this person's motivations are. I mean, actually, one of the companies I work for, the founder and I, we became really good friends. I trust him completely because I read his book. And so I know exactly where he's thinking. And he knows that too. I'm like, I know where you're coming from. You have the right heart. I know exactly the company you started, it's because you had this problem. And it should let you into that. I mean, I just read the biography of Elon Musk by Ashley Vance. And there's a couple of stories in that book that are just, have you read it, Zoe?
Yeah. Yep.
I mean, there's a couple of stories in that book that cracked me up. One of them is they're at a Mexican restaurant and Elon Musk is talking to his biographer. He's dating a new woman and he said, I'm considering allocating 8.25 hours per week to her. Is that sufficient? Like, who talks like that? It's like a robot. And then the story that I liked, though, well, the other thing that was interesting was Elon Musk was bullied as a kid. And so he spent all this time in the library and in the bookstore, and he still reads at least a book a day right now, running $4 or $5 billion companies. But the story that really impressed me about him was at SpaceX, he always is asking his engineers questions, and they were starting to get annoyed. They're like, I already got this job. Is he interviewing me? But then they started comparing notes. They're like, wait a second. He's listening to our answers. He's learning. And we think he actually understands it better than we do now. I mean, wow, that's amazing. I mean, you look at, if I'm an investor, I'm going to read anything that Warren Buffett has ever written because I'm like, what is it? What's he doing differently than other people? When I read Nelson Mandela's biography, I'm like, oh my gosh, this guy, where do people like this come? It's like when I read Gandhi's autobiography cracked me up. I always tell people, you got to read Gandhi's autobiography. And my favorite thing to point out to people is, look at the copyright date, 1925. He wrote his autobiography 20 years before he freed India. It's the most amazing. I'm like, where do people like that come from? And so I get excited about books when I'm reading about, wow, they think in this way. That's a very different way than the way I think. I'm like, I need to shut up and listen to those people. So long answer to a short question.
That's a beautiful insight too. I think so. 2 big insights. It's reading as passport to the world, and 2, you get to see how other people think. And along with that, and you alluded to it, is that it's one of the best ways to develop compassion and empathy is by exposing yourself to so many other different life stories. You get an insight into different cultures and different points of view. My sister is one of the best readers around. She doesn't have any filters in terms of what she reads. Having said that, she mostly sticks with literary fiction, but a diverse range of authors from all sorts of different countries. And so she has lots of different insights into different cultures as a result of that. And I think that's one of the most practical reasons of why we should read. So I want to capture some hacks now because all my listeners are like, I need practical things I can implement. And so we've talked about a couple. You shared a couple of different tips of how to get more reading done. One is to build it into existing habits. So before you watch TV, you read a book using your iPhone to prompt something, whether it's a habit of memorization or to read something. What are some other tips for hacking to get more reading done?
Yeah, so that's a great question, Zoe. I always say use your car as a mobile university. I mean, like if your commute is a half an hour a day, that's a half an hour a day, at least 5 days a week that you have a chance to be listening to audiobooks or podcasts. But I downloaded 2 audiobooks. One was the autobiography of Will Smith, the actor, narrated by him. And then I listened to that. It was fascinating. And then I listened to the actor Matthew McConaughey, his autobiography, Green Lights, which had I didn't realize he had lived in Australia. He'd been an exchange student. It was a funny story. That was actually a really touching book. There were some great little anecdotes in that book. And again, this is what I always tell people. I mean, you should read looking for that one gem. I mean, when I'm training business people how to craft a powerful presentation, one of the first things I say is, okay, I know I'm giving you the fire hose. Tonight, I want you to grab a pen and paper, a libation of choice. I want you to sit down, and I want you to write down every story of everything that's ever happened in your life. And I don't mean the whole story. I just mean triggers. So like the time I locked myself out of the car out in front of the grocery store, the time Dad spilt mustard on his tie when we were at that fancy restaurant. Because in about an hour or 2, you'll come up with about 500 stories. And then what I tell people to do, so that's part 1. Part 2 is now I want you to figure out, well, what's the lesson of this story? Because, the time I locked myself out of the car, that's really a story of overcoming adversity. The time that I tattled on my brother when we were in first grade, that's really a story about responsibility. I mean, my own computer is loaded with folders filled with topics like, oh, here's stories about love. Here's stories about loyalty. Here's stories about leadership. And then, you know, you and I both love reading personal development books. I always tell people, first of all, everybody has interesting stories. They might not realize it, but everybody has interesting stories. But if you're determined and stubborn to say nothing ever interesting ever happens to you, well, one of the most popular personal development books of all time is Think and Grow Rich by Napoleon Hill. And that book has none of his personal stories. It's all about stories of famous billionaires that he's spoken to, and he's using their stories. And this is why I'm always interested in finding. I mean, I just read a story the other day. The book was horrible, 300 pages. Most of it was a waste of time, but it didn't matter. There was 2 pages that gave me a great story, Zoe. It was about this marketer who was trying to figure out how he was going to make his fortune. He was going all around the world trying to figure out what would make a fortune. Well, he's in Chile watching these fishermen fish, and he notices they're catching all these fish, and then there's fish that they throw out, but those were the fish that they would eat. And so he asked the fishermen, he's like, oh, are you eating these fish because the other ones go to market? And they're like, no, we're eating this fish because it's much tastier than the fish that they pay us to catch. And so he's like, may I try it? They say, sure. He's like, oh my gosh, this fish is delicious. What's it called? And they say, it is called the toothfish. He's like, the toothfish? That's the worst name I've ever heard. And so he brought the toothfish to the United States, and it's now the best-selling fish on every menu in every fancy restaurant. He just changed the name from toothfish to the Chilean sea bass. I love that. The whole book, horrible book. That story alone was worth the whole book. And if I can find anything, I mean, this is why I watch sports. I mean, my wife gets annoyed with me because I love sports, but I'm like, honey, at any given moment, something extraordinary can happen. You never know. I'm always looking for those inspiration. That's why I love the Olympics. There's always my wife gets mad at me because I always root against America during the Olympics. She's like, why are you rooting against America? I'm like, well, honey, who am I going to root for? The American with the microchip in his Nike shoes as he's running, or the barefoot Sudanese refugee who they just told his story. He's like, oh, I learned how to running away from the bullets in my village. Of course I'm rooting for that guy. I mean, that's fantastic. I mean, this is why I love Australia. I'm a huge swim fan. And one of my favorite swimmers of all time is Ian Thorpe. But one of my favorite Olympics was, it was a relay. I don't know if it was the 4x100 or whatever, but the Americans were just cocky and they said, oh, we're going to play the Australians like guitars. And the Australians beat them. And I always loved it because the Australians, they mimicked like they were playing guitars. I was like, oh, good for them. I just thought that was, I thought that was a great, or like when the Olympics were in Sydney and just watching Kathy Freeman, I'm like, wow. She had so much pressure on her, and she came through, just amazing. And there's stories like that all the time. Life's too short, Zoe. It's the same thing. One of the reasons I started training people how to create presentations is I was judging a speaking competition. There was 1,300 speeches, and none of them were funny. They were all so depressing. And I'm not saying that's not effective, but you know what? The world just overcame a pandemic. There's a lot of depression on this planet. I think we need hope. I don't think we need that depressing, sad song. I mean, when I was a little kid, greatest thing my dad ever did, he always tried to get me to read. But then the other thing he always made me do is he only let me watch PBS most of the time, public television in America. And public television on Saturday nights, they had the Paul Hogan show, which was the funniest thing. They'd have Paul Hogan and Monty Python. And I'm like, wow, I'm a well-rounded individual because I got most of my sense of humor from Paul Hogan and Monty Python. And it's amazing. Americans, they think of Paul Hogan as Crocodile Dundee, and I'm like, well, that's a good movie, but I mean, the Paul Hogan show is really fun. And I can't remember the name of his buddies. I can never remember. That show was great. I remember that growing up was the greatest thing I'd ever seen. I'm sorry, I'm going off on a tangent.
It's lovely, and I think it highlights one of the gifts of reading is that just to give you stories of humanity. And I think you're right. We absolutely need that in our lives, and we need that in our leadership. So, Danny, where can people find out more about you and your work?
Well, Zoe, thank you. As a thank you to everybody, including you, for listening to me, I wanted to give everybody a couple of freebies. So if you go to freegiftfromdanny.com, again, freegiftfromdanny.com, I'm going to give everybody 2 gifts. First of all, I'm giving everybody a complimentary e-copy of my book, Read, Lead, and Succeed. This is a book I wrote for a school principal who was trying to keep his faculty and staff positively engaged. So I said, okay, I'll write you a book. So every week I give you a concept, an inspirational quote, an inspirational story, a book recommendation on a book you should read, but you're probably too lazy because you're an adult. So I also give you a children's picture book recommendation, demonstrates the same concept. You can read that in 5 minutes. And I love now seeing these meetings now with these CEOs starting off with a Dr. Seuss book. And then secondly, I'm going to give everybody access. Last summer, I did a 5-day reading challenge online for about 700 parents around the world, where every day for an hour for a week, I'll give you all kinds of strategies on how to get your kid excited about reading. Because again, my goal is to get kids to read more, read better, and most importantly, to love reading. As Mark Twain once said, don't let school get in the way of your education. That's what I love. People like you, Zoe, that love to read. I have friends that graduated from prestigious universities, and they brag to me, that was the last time I opened up a book. And I'm like, well, you're an idiot. I'd much rather hang out with high school dropouts that are reading science fiction books that we can, people that talk politics are so boring to me. I want to hear about like the stories that you're reading, whether it's fiction or nonfiction. So much more interesting. And you had said something I like, it connects us too. I miss this. I think people need to spend more time, like just having time for another human being, listening to what they have to say. And you don't have to agree with everything. My wife disagrees with half of what I say, but it doesn't mean we're not loving and respectful of one another. And I think we'd all be a lot better off with that kind of attitude.
Danny, thank you so much. You've been absolutely delightful, and I've loved talking about reading and books. It's filled my cup today, so thank you so much.
Oh, thank you, Zoe. Thanks for all you do, and just holler whenever you need anything. I'll end, whether I was teaching my little ones or my older ones as a teacher, as they exited my classroom, they had to hear the same refrain every day. I always said, remember, kids, education is valuable, but execution is priceless. Knowledge is not power. Only applied knowledge is power. Knowing what the right thing to do and doing the right thing are two very different things. Go out, do the right thing, and make this world a better place. Or, as my pastor always says, I don't expect you to do everything I just suggested, but please, do something.
Well, I totally loved that conversation with Danny. I hope you did too. My tips for the key takeaways for you to take action on straight away are this. First of all, number one, determine why you want to read. Is it because you want to gain new insights? Is it because you want anecdotes and stories for your presentations? Is it because you want to develop your wisdom and insight and compassion? Whatever the reason is for you, make sure that you have a compelling why that works and is meaningful for you. Number two, use the when-then habit to create the new habit of reading. What I mean by that, like Danny's example, when I watch TV, before I watch TV, I read a book. Or, for example, when I go to bed, before I turn the lights out, I read a book. So identify where and when you could attach the reading habit to an existing habit and location and build it in. Number three, track your reading. I use Goodreads to do that, and you can hack yourself. Get used to the dopamine addiction of completing a book and have it rank up in your number of books read for the year. You can join the reading challenge. You can set how many books you want to read for the year and endeavor to go about reading them. And you can develop a reading plan as a result of that, as I shared mine on the call today. So, number three is track your reading. And number four is share the insights. I sometimes post my insights with my Amplifiers Club, or I share the passages that I've highlighted on Goodreads, or I share the insights with my broader audience in my newsletter. Whichever way you want to do it, share your insights. And if you're loving more stuff on books, make sure you sign up to my exclusive book newsletter called Bookish. And if you go to my website, just click on books, you'll be able to see a link for Bookish. You can get on my occasional newsletter where I do book reviews. I share insights and updates from my latest fictional and non-fictional work. Yes, it's coming. It is coming. We've got Terra Blanca coming out, being released soon-ish. And Olympus Bound, the sequel to Olympus Project, is coming out too. So if you want to get on top of all that, get deals and insights behind the scenes, as well as book reviews. That's bookish on my website, zoerouth.com. In the meantime, happy reading. Make sure that you live well, lead well.
You've been listening to the Zoe Routh Leadership Podcast. To find out more about leadership of the future or to contact Zoe, go to zoerouth.com.